This is 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World, a podcast miniseries brought to you by the Matan Women's Institute for Torah Studies. This entire series is dedicated in memory of the heroes our nation has lost in the past year and a half, and in prayer for the return of our remaining hostages. Welcome back to 7 Biblical Readings for a Post-October 7th World, where each week one of the Jewish world's most erudite and wisdom-seeking Torah scholars is exploring an iconic biblical text in light of the changing Israeli, Jewish, and world realities since that fateful and horrific October day. My partner in conversation today is Yael Leibowitz, who is currently teaching at Matan and Midrashet Lindenbaum. In 2022, Yael received the Matan Kitvuni Writers Fellowship and has a book forthcoming on Ezra-Nehemiah through Koren Press called Retrograde Revolution. To read more of Yael's writings, visit yaelleibowitz.com. Yael, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks so much. It's always great to be back.
If anyone would like to sponsor an episode in memory of a fallen soldier, civilian, or in prayer for the return of one of our hostages, please write to us at podcast@matan.org.il. And Yael, our topic for today, as you well know, is the topic of biblical women, but unfortunately the difficult topic of the mistreatment of them, or even we would say violence against women. The connection to the events of October 7th is clear. We saw sort of one of the most blatant, violent acts of pure mutilation that were done to women and that were done in overtly sexual ways, particularly at the Nova Festival, and not only, and of course also many reports that have come out about sexual violence that has been committed against women also who were hostages in captivity. And this is a really difficult topic. There were a few nice efforts to try and speak about them. Sheryl Sandberg's Screams Before Silence, she created that with the whole team when they basically realized that actually nobody cared and nobody said anything. And all of these, feminist groups that were there to protest rapes in Rwanda and protest rapes in all over the world seemed to not really have that much to say about the overt mutilation and raping of women in Israel. And so we will come back to that in our conversation. But what's really interesting, and that we'll get into today, is that the Tanakh has a lot to say about the mistreatment of women, and things I think that are, I would say, also really preceded their times, meaning that we're quite advanced. But very often it's said in very subtle ways, and it's said in ways that we have to sort of dive deep into the text, into the way it's structured, to really see what it's trying to tell us. So with that introduction, and again, we'll circle back to October 7th later on, why don't you bring us in a little bit to the world of biblical women? It's always a little bit obnoxious to try and let's talk about biblical women
in the Bible.
But women in the Bible. But there are some broad ideas that I think are worth sort of putting at the center of this conversation as we begin it.
Yeah, so I think it's really important. I will say that the topic of violence against women, and as you mentioned, we're going to circle back to it, but the topic about violence against women and violence that was perpetrated against women specifically in Tanakh has been almost like a breeding ground for feminist criticism of the Bible and claims that, see, we told you the Bible is misogynistic and the Bible doesn't care and the Bible, condones behaviors like that. So one of the things we always need to be very, very cognizant of when we're studying Tanakh is to distinguish between an isolated incident or an isolated narrative, and then taking a step back and panning the camera out and saying, okay, but what is the author of this specific work or this specific book trying to communicate to us, right? If I open up a random book about slavery in America and I happen to open up to the few pages that describe the beating of a slave, it would be completely intellectually dishonest of me to then close the book and say, see, I knew the author was a racist, right? The book may very well be condemning slavery and explaining how brutal it was, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think the same goes for Tanakh, and, we'll give examples of that today, but I think that's sort of the starting point we always need to have for any discussion about Tanakh is, what does Tanakh wholesale say about women? And then when we narrow in, what does every given sefer have to say, or how are they utilizing women as a medium to communicate those specific ideas? And then look at the narratives themselves. So Tikva Freimer-Kensky was taught actually women's studies at the University of Chicago years ago, but she was also an Assyriologist by training. And so she knew ancient languages, and she was able to, to read texts that were in Akkadian and Ugaritic, etc. And one of the things, she actually wrote a book on women of the Bible. I don't remember if it was called Women in the Bible or Women of the Bible. And what I actually found most interesting about her book is the intro, because what she says is she assumed, based on where she was coming from, that the Tanakh, like many people assume, is chauvinistic, and she was going to be writing a book that was going to show that Tanakh sort of makes the same assumptions about women as all ancient patriarchal societies did. And what she comes to and what she begins to understand through points of contrast, again, with the societies that really encircled Israel or served as the backdrop for the Tanakh, is that Tanakh is very unique in its presentation of women. And she distinguishes between two words that I think are really, really critical. She says, there's no question that Tanakh represents a patriarchal world. That was the society that it was written in. That was the world in which the ancient Israel existed. But within a patriarchal world, to say that women are subordinate, which is something that is created by society, it's very different than to call women inherently inferior. And what she discovered is that women are certainly presented as subordinate within that world, but they are never described or depicted as inherently inferior. And so what that distinction does is it's really, really important, because once we understand that the Tanakh, the divine word of the Bible, is claiming inherent equality between the sexes, right? It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be doing exactly the same things in the world. But once there's an inherent equality, then the whole conversation shifts. So, I think there's a couple of implications for that distinction. I think the first one being that women in Tanakh, for this reason, that they were subordinate but not believed to be inferior, serve as a really important metaphor for Israel, right? Because Israel, in many ways, was
she also writes in that introduction.
Yes, I'm building on of her ideas. I'm just sort of, paraphrasing her ideas that women, Israel in the ancient world was oftentimes subordinate to other stronger, more powerful, more sophisticated nations. So stories about women who are able to sort of transcend the limitations that society has imposed on them serves as a really, really important metaphor for Israel. And, we could give lots of examples. You talk about the women in Egypt who are written off as innocuous, which is why Paro says only kill the boys. And then it's the women that end up emerging as the heroines of the story and the ones that dictate really how the story plays out. You have Rachav, who lives in that liminal space in the wall between Canaan, between the cities inside and the world outside. And she becomes the metaphor for Israel, who's existing in that liminal space just as they're about to enter, and they learn that their voices can make them central to history, et cetera, et cetera.
And she joins also these women with the category of the underdog in general, meaning we have these underdog, the people who you wouldn't expect to be the leaders, but then are the leaders, the one who's left-handed, or all these other kinds of examples. And she also joins it with, I think she does, even the theme of the younger outdoing the older. Maybe not her.
Yeah, I don't think that, but I think I'm not sure if that was.
The sort of the reversal of primogeniture, that correct. Also meaning that that Israel, our stories, our basic narratives, are constantly filled with the surprising heroine, correct. Or the surprising leader, which all kind of fits in. And she added the woman piece, which was that major contribution. That we have so many examples, and that what she says is that we told her that those stories were created, which here I would, I would differ with her just in terms of my own belief system.
Preserved, we can play
that these were the stories that were triumphant because they were very meaningful to the people of Israel, who were very self-conscious of the fact that they're this, small nation who didn't seem to be particularly successful, who was indeed chosen by God.
Yeah, 100%. The individuals resonate with what the people need to hear, right? Like you're talking about the underdog, not specifically to women. So the man with the speech impediment, Moshe, becomes the most important orator in history. The man who can't fight and he's running out in his shepherd's cloth is the warrior, right? So Esther Hamalka, the Queen Esther, is when we are in galut, when we are displaced from our native home, when we are orphaned as a people, so it's the orphan who ends up emerging as the queen. So I think those are really, really critical. But going back to your opening, those can only work, or those can only be appreciated, and the messages can only resonate if we're talking about a society that by definition sort of understands, or a corpus of literature, right? We'll distinguish between Tanakh and the people who populate its pages, but it can only exist in a corpus of literature that doesn't see women as inherently inferior. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing that I think is really, really important, which leads us into the topic of violence against women, is the way in which women are used as a gauge for society, right? And again, it's not, like you mentioned, it's not just women. Women are one example of a person, right? A woman would be an example of a person who is not inherently inferior, but circumstantially is subordinate.
She can be taken advantage of.
Correct. So she's no different than an orphan or a widow who are not inherently inferior. Life just dealt them blows that make them, they have less of a support group, they have less of a network, things like that. So I think that women really serve as a gauge oftentimes in the different works of Tanakh. So I think, a great example would be, before we even talk about violence, but just women and how they're valued or how they're seen. If we look at the book of Samuel, for example, it's not just about looking at the personalities, which is, certainly a component of it, but it's really more broadly speaking, an expose on power, an expose on the institution of kingship, which the Tanakh very, very clearly frowns upon and does not feel is an ideal institution. And once it's implemented, nevertheless, so what the book of Samuel does is it sort of looks at that institution. What are its failings? What are its weak points? How is power abused? And what does that abuse look like? So women are this amazing sort of gauge, both for the personalities, for the kings themselves, and also for what the institution is doing wrong. If we look early on in, David is running away from Shaul and he encounters Abigail. And in that moment, David is about to use brute force, and he's about to be really brutal with his group of soldiers and slaughter everyone in Naval's household. Naval was a man who was, refused, I would say back early in the days before David is coronated. So he's sort of running around as I would guess we would call him a renegade soldier, right? With a renegade
militia.
Renegade militia with a group of lowlives. And what they essentially do is they go to these rich estates and they say, we will protect you, assuming you provide us with provisions. And Naval says, absolutely not, I don't want it. So if you don't provide us with provisions, the implication is we will, destroy your household. And Abigail, his wife, comes out. And what she really does is I hate to use this, this sort of maybe overused term, but she speaks truth to power. And she says to David, David, slaughtering an entire household because your ego has been, perhaps infringed upon is maybe not the right move. And is this really royal, what you're about to do? And David takes a step back and he gets it and he understands and he restrains himself. And that ability to hear her rationale and hear that voice of reason and restrain himself is really important, because later on in his life, there are times when he's not able to do that. And restraint is, the Achilles heel of all of these men who are given unbridled power.
And then that story, when her husband dies, right, he takes her as a wife, which should, I think, be understood as a gesture of care.
Yes.
Meaning he wants to care for this woman who saved him from making a fatal error.
Right.
And so he takes her under his
wing. And not leave her as a widow.
And not leave her as a widow. And
absolutely.
leave her susceptible to the whims of society.
Right. That's something else we also have to be careful when we read and we're like, oh, that's not romantic. It's not about romance, right? No, it's about protecting the vulnerable. And she would have necessarily been vulnerable had she been left alone. And that was, like you're saying, a really benevolent move on David's part. Absolutely. But again, if we move through the different episodes, you look at Michal, who is a heroine who risks her life to save David and let him out the window. And then at the same time, her love is not, it's not reciprocated by David. And then later on in the story, when David is coronated and he wants to sort of make sure that there are no loose ends that aren't tied up, he brings Michal, who had already been happily married, the text seems to imply, to another man. He brings her back to his house as a show of power and essentially uses her as a pawn in this big chess game of military chess game. So there's lots and lots of examples. I think the most obvious one is the story of Bathsheba, right, which is the low point the Tanakh makes very clear in the life of David, in David's career. It sort of is the beginning of the end in many ways, which Matan Hanavi predicts. And that's a perfect example of an innocent, unsuspecting woman. And as a side point, I want to put on the side, I think any of the midrashic attempts to blame her for seducing David are really, really problematic pedagogically and with everything we know today about, victims being blamed, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just put that as a little asterisk on the side. Meaning I understand the inclination of our sages to defend our heroes, and there's something really, really important and didactic in that. But, with what we know as we evolve as a species, we do have to just be careful about messaging that could be problematic.
So I just want to gather together some of these pieces. Essentially what you're saying is that we could look at almost any book. I would say maybe to the exception of the book of Joshua, by the way, but that's a different conversation. Okay. We can look at almost any book and sort of collect the way that women are interacted with and the female figures and gauge a real sense of what are some of the criticisms that we have about the institution or society at that time and the way that they are functioning. You know what it reminds me a little bit of? The great speech given to the EU that was also then written into book future tense by Rabbi Sachs about the different anti-Semitic mutations, right? He talks about the 4 mutations. And one of the things he says that then gets quoted everywhere is that show me how a society treats its Jews and I will tell you what is its greatest social ill, right? That is sort of like the bleeding lesion of society and it reflects something about the sickness of that society.
And the canary in the coal mine also is like is the apt metaphor that people talk about. The idea, the canary that they would send into the coal mines, and if there were, I think, if I'm not mistaking, the origins of the metaphor, and there were too many gases, then the canary would die, and then they would know that it's not safe to send people in. Okay. Right. So anti-Semitism is always sort of the predictor of the trajectory of any given society, which Douglas Murray is talking about now.
Exactly, and he's quoting Rabbi Sachs.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, that's
when
awesome.
He says that, and I think he knows that, by the way.
Oh, that's good. Okay.
So if we go back to the woman piece, is that the treatment of women becomes kind of like a barometer of how healthy or ill the society is, right? That's our claim
exactly
so far.
It. Right.
Okay.
It could be society wholesale. It could be the institutions we're looking at, depending on the text, right? When Avshalom is, it says Avshalom sleeps with all his father's concubines as on the roof as a show of power against his David when he's revolting. But, we're forgetting that in that statement, it's not just about David and Avshalom. There are women who are being raped on the roof of the palace. So, and I think Tanakh is really, really sensitive to, what we call the collateral damage of these power institutions. Yeah. So going back to your opening, because, October 7th was one of these moments in time that I think we're still unpacking in many ways, the myriads of implications for obvious reasons. But like you said, I think for women, for Jews, one of the most jarring pieces is how the world responded, and specifically to women's issues, right? We're in a world where microaggressions are so offensive and someone could get fired for implying something to a female employer, but women are literally raped and dismembered and their bodies are mutilated and the world remains silent. And that was very, very jarring. I heard quoted by a woman who works with victims of sexual abuse. She said that our nation was collectively raped on October 7th. And it's such a startling, but also very, very powerful, I think, metaphor.
2 thoughts come up when you just even briefly recall, that day. One of them is about the reactions of others, and one of them is the reaction, I will just speak about myself, but I don't think I'm the only one. On a personal level, the descriptions that did make it to my ears were so horrific that I know that I, as a member of a woman of Israel, wanted to shut it out. Yeah. And also I'll say this, and we're 2 women having conversation. Our listeners are both male and female, and it could be that I grew up in an era where there also was stranger danger and maybe they also overemphasized the following. But I grew up very aware of the fact that I was susceptible to violence. And once in a while I'll have this joke with my husband. I'll be like, oh yeah, you're going to go out and walk at night and feel comfortable. And I'll be like, no, I was taught not to do that. And even if I do it, I'm very conscious. I'll never wear headphones, let's say, walking out at night.
Or Oprah teaches you to put the keys between your fingers.
Okay, so you were educated by Oprah. Yeah, excellent. But we grew up as women being taught that this is a danger. Now, it's not so crazy because up until really, really recent, rape was a very regular, it still obviously exists in the world, but it was also highly not investigated. There wasn't the same retribution, right? That was meted out to mostly the men who committed these things. And so,
except for Golda Meir, by the way, her famous quote. when there were higher incidences of rape when she was I'm pretty sure it was when she was prime minister, and they said, we should have a curfew for the women. She goes, if women are being raped, then there should be a curfew for the men.
Yes. Okay. I actually recently just read another biography of hers and I forgot. Okay. Yeah. But that's a great quote. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Pretty on point.
Yes. And I think that that's without October 7th and without wars, and where we know that rape has been a major part of them, and only in 1992 does the UN come out with a statement, which they clearly weren't interested in in investing in on this October 7th, where they come out with a statement, claiming that rape in war, which was always a tool of war, is an international crime. And so the first is, I just want to say, and I would almost say confess, that I personally, I already have an instilled fear in me. That I almost didn't want to look because it plays up on what is already something that lives inside of me. Yeah. And that's me being part of these people. So even more so, the rest of the world who says that's disgusting, I don't really want to see that, or I'm going to turn up. I'm not justifying it. Right. I'm just saying that I feel terrible that I almost didn't sit with that pain enough because I know that it's something.
By the way, the mothers of the female hostages not you. It's not just you. I was watching them being interviewed months ago before, when the girls were still being held. And one, I don't remember, I don't know if it was Donnie Kushmar, I don't remember who was interviewing them. And they said something about rape, and he winced and they said, see that not wanting to talk about them being raped, that's and they called, him and by extension, all of us on exactly what you're talking about. It's almost too sickening to go there mentally, so we don't.
By the way, because it's both a violation of the women's bodies and it's an utter perversion of male sexuality, meaning it's an act that is a complete criminal act against a woman's body and a perversion of men. Yes. And so it's disgusting to anybody. Because those impulses exist in people, but they're not something that we want to think about very, very often. And so I just want to put that piece here, which is that there is something about this particular kind of violence that really makes you want to run very, very far away.
I saw an article. I don't know if this is, again, I don't know how well documented, and you don't know causation, but they were saying that the incidence of, and I'm a big believer in sort of psychosomatic and, the somatic manifestations of emotions. There was an article, I don't remember where I read it, maybe Idiot, that yeast infections and urinary tract infections among women in this country went up by a really significant margin.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think we were all, you feel it in your uterus, you feel it in your body in a way that like you're saying, we try to suppress it, but it's there, and it manifested, again, according to this article, in all of these physical, physiological ways, which I found really moving and heartbreaking all at the same time.
Mamash.
I'll just say, I think, you mentioned the world, that it's hard to look. Again, and I know you're not trying to give them,
no, not
an
just
exit ramp
at all.
I don't know that that's the reason, actually, because I think there was such voyeurism because of the way the mutilations, and I'm not talking just the rape, but the murders were documented, and people were fine watching those videos. Yes. I think ignoring the women is part, again, if we're going back to women as a metaphor, is part of the bigger, right? You can't argue that the rape and mutilation of women's bodies, that they're not the victims. And I think ignoring it is really just the metaphor for what the world is doing, which is ignoring the fact that we were the victims on that day.
Yeah.
I don't think it's them, not being able to watch because it's too painful. I think it's the perfect metaphor. You can't argue that those women were not victims.
Exactly. No, that's exactly what I wanted to say. That the women become sort of the prism through which we see the world ignoring the people of Israel.
Yes.
Again, while there are complexities to all different elements of the conflict that we perpetually find ourselves in, there was something utterly not complex about what happened on that day.
Correct.
And the world tried to pretend that there was a complexity to it, and then immediately flipped it on its head. And it was exactly that. It was taking the victim and turning them perverting them into something else completely.
Yeah, and I think the ignoring of rape was even, meaning you're talking, again, the contrast between the world of Me Too movement and microaggressions versus what happened there at the Nova and in the homes that were invaded. It's, it's the micro of the macro, like you're saying. It's trying to complicate something that is so not complicated. And I think that's why they ignored the violence against women, because it didn't really jive with their narrative, which, is sort of the unfortunate reality of a lot of what we're watching.
So why don't we take a step into the book of Judges, the book of Shoftim, because that book, while it's also a particularly strong criticism of the people of Israel, in that same vein of this sort of metaphor, micro, macro, also has some of the broadest treatment or presentation of women throughout those stories.
Right, which is fascinating. And, again, the contrast, like you're saying, is what I think makes it most stark and most powerful. So one of the things that, is interesting about the way women are used in Shoftim, and we're not going to get too into what the book as a whole is doing, but essentially it's covering approximately 150-year period from 1200 BCE to about 1050 BCE, and it's chronicling those years, and essentially it's making the case for kingship, and it's showing how a society can devolve and can become so, like you mentioned before, so systemically evil that it will implode if things don't change. And the punchline is, therefore, you need a king, which leads us to the book of Samuel. But one of the things that's really interesting is that the book of Judges is not organized chronologically necessarily. It's organized thematically, and there's lots of internal clues to that point. And so what it does is it goes from sort of the high points in the period, or it organizes it from the high points, from the ideals, from the gold standards, and moves all the way down to the lowest point where there is nowhere to go other than change. So women, I use this example in my class when I talk to my students. I tell them to think about Schindler's List. And I might be botching the details of this because I don't remember it exactly. But if you remember, the whole movie was in black and white. And what Steven Spielberg does is, on some level, when we watch things go from point A to point, to the ends of the movie, or from point A to, let's say, Auschwitz. So because it happened gradually, which is, I think, often the case when anti-Semitism is on the rise, things like that, it's almost hard to remember where we started as you're watching things gradually get worse and worse. And so one of the brilliant features of that movie is that it was all in black and white, except for that girl in the red, I don't remember if it was red or pink, right? But there was that one color in the movie. And you have the girl at the beginning of the movie playing in her red jacket in the streets, with her friends. And then as things are getting worse, you see the red jacket pop up again in the ghetto. And then it's getting worse. The red jacket is on the cattle car. And then, of course, finally, we see the red jacket just in a pile of clothing. And we understand the implication is that the girl had been gassed or, murdered. And so Sefer Shoftim is talking about a 150-year period where things go from great to terrible, to that point of no return almost. And one of the things that the author does in order to ensure that we see that deterioration is he also leaves markers that I liken to the red coat of Steven Spielberg. So, you mentioned earlier lefties. So we have the Ehud Ben Gera, the famous lefty who was able to kill the corpulent King Eglon, who was threatening Israel by drawing from his right, with his left hand. Lefties are the assumed underdog in the stories. And, he's the hero, but then at the end of the book, the lefties are from the tribe of Benjamin, who are fighting as lefties in a civil war, right? You have the righteous judges at the beginning, and then the quality of judges just keeps deteriorating as the work goes on. We have lots of examples of this as the stories ensue. One of the things that we watch also evolve as the work goes on is family dynamics. You have these healthy families where things are really running correctly, and then as the stories go on, those family dynamics begin to break up, which is another indicator from the perspective of the author that something is wrong in society. But the most, I think, powerful motif, that symbol, right, that's drawn throughout the Sefer, that's used as that red jacket, so to speak, is women. You have, at the very, very beginning of the work, you have Achsa. And there's these few verses dedicated to Achsa. She's the daughter of Kalev, who is the leader. He's sort of a throwback to the generation of Moshe.
It's a story that's repeated from the book of Joshua and brought in here to be that sort of like, let's overlap the two books that we feel them connected.
Correct, right? Yeah. It's sort of bridging the two. And he's almost like, you would say, the last of that generation of the greats, so to speak. And his daughter, there's just this adorable little narrative in the beginning of the work where he promises that whoever's able to capture the city of Kiryat Arba will get both his daughter, as a prize, which again, if we keep our modern sensibilities out of it, it means she's married to a war hero. He's connected to,
it's a win-win for all.
It's a win-win for all. There's nothing romantic, but also nothing offensive about it. And we see after they're married, she goes back, she gets onto a donkey and travels back to her father's home. And she says, Dad, I really appreciate it, but we want land with a little more water. And her father says, okay. And that's the end. And it seems like this sort of almost extraneous extraneous little incident until we realize that Achsa is the gold standard in the work. Achsa is a daughter who's independent, who speaks to her father, who makes assumptions about what she deserves and what her place is in the world.
Who loves the land of Israel and wants more of it.
Correct.
Which connects her a little bit also back to the daughters of Tzofchad.
Correct.
But it also will contrast her with the people who are lazy in their conquering, and that the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, becomes this. It's a book that exists because they didn't finish the job in the period of Joshua.
Right, the critique of what the generation prior.
But she wants more. Just give me more.
She wants more, and she feels completely safe getting onto an animal, going out on the roads, and there's no fear. You mentioned before stranger danger. She has no stranger danger, which is not a reflection of her not being educated by Oprah, right? It's a reflection of the world in which she lives.
So happy Oprah made her appearance.
I can't stand her. Finding a separate topic, but it's a reflection of the world in which she lives, right? People who don't lock their front doors, does it make them naive, or does it make the world that they live in safe? And so she is that gold standard in many ways. She speaks to her father, makes demands of him. She becomes that, again, gauge that we keep going back to. She's the girl in the red jacket playing happily with her friends in the street.
I never thought about it like that, Yael. I like that reading. Okay.
But I will say, and I don't think we have a lot of time, so I'm not going to get too into the details, but as we move forward, we have Devorah, who is both a prophetess and a war, a general going out to war, and a judge who is adjudicating. She's actually one of the few, the word judge, we call the Sefer Shoftim, it's actually a misnomer because they weren't actually adjudicating. They were just
leaders,
ad hoc military leaders for the most part. She's the only one in the book that actually earns the title Shofet, judge, because she would sit under the tree, and she's sort of, it evokes the image of Moshe sitting in one spot, people coming to her with questions. And so she's this wonderful, feminine leader. And it's fascinating because she calls Barak her general, and she says, listen, God spoke to me and he said it's time to go out to war. And Barak makes this really fascinating sort of qualification. He goes, I'll go with you. I'll go out to war, but only if you come. And Devorah says, okay, but just know the glory of the victory is not going to go to you, it's going to go to a woman. Right? So anyone reading those words are like, oh, okay, so here's this, woman who's an exception to the rule, and we're talking about a victor. So of course the victory will go to Devorah. It's only later on when we read further that we realize that it's actually Yael that the victory goes to. And so as readers, we're taken aback and we're saying, hold on, if there's an exception to the rule and then there's another exception to the rule, at what point do they stop being exceptions and do those types of women become the rule, right? Which is, and so that's, I think, the beginning of the work. But of course, things begin.
Which is interesting, by the way, because some commentaries, modern commentaries, try and read the story of Devorah as being the entirety of it being an additional underdog story, which I don't like the reading at all. Meaning,
why do they say that though?
They say that, well, we had the left-handed judge beforehand, and then we have a woman, right? Where else in the book are we going to have a female judge? And they read it as part of this, the surprising less than figures who make it to the top in the period of the judges because there really is no one good to lead. But I think that that's a misreading, and that the first 3 or 4, depending how you read it, judges are positive judges, and then the last 3 are negative judges. And so therefore we don't have to take anything away from Devorah. But it goes back to that original reading that we said earlier, which is that what the Bible comes and does is give an accurate reflection of life at that time. Was it completely commonplace that you had, were women everywhere leaders or adjudicators? No, but you had unique circumstances, and the Tanakh presents it as just this is what was. Meaning there's no sentence that comes and says, this was very unusual, what happened in the time of Devorah. No, it narrates it as it was. And so you accept it naturally.
Yeah. It's not just a misreading of Shoftim, it's, of Judges, it's like you were saying before, it's a misreading of the entire sort of motif that is threaded through Tanakh. That, the underdog, it's not just the underdog wins. The underdog wins because then it points to God working in tandem, meaning if David...
And making themselves worthy.
And making themselves worthy, and also showing that victory is not because of inherent qualities, right? If David were an amazing warrior who defeated Goliath, that's not exciting. It's exciting because he was so clearly at the physical disadvantage, but he goes out in the name of God and God enables him to win. So it's a misreading for a lot of reasons.
Exactly.
And by the way, Yael, just going back to what you were saying, it's the Tanakh is also, I think, very aware of the world's expectations of women. One of the things that makes Yael's story so fascinating is she plays into Sisera's assumptions about, a woman can't do. He runs to her home and assumes he's safe in her tent because what can a woman do to me at the end, right? Yeah. And he asks for, right? It says he just demands that she bring him water, right? And then in the poetic version of the story, she brings him milk, which sort of feeds into those maternal expectations. She covers him with a blanket. She feeds into the assumptions that a man in a patriarchal world will have about a woman, and then takes the domestic, tent peg and kills him. So those are sort of the highlights. Those are the times where women can behave that way because the world was still a good world, so to speak. But then as the stories go on, as you mentioned, things get worse and worse. And we have the infamous story of Yiftach, who wasn't a bad man for all intents and purposes. He makes a mistake, and he makes a vow in wartime, which was commonplace for most warriors. And he says, the first thing to run out of my home when I get home, I'll sacrifice, which he meant an animal, because they had animals living among, with the people we're talking, late Bronze Age. We didn't have separate farms where the animals lived apart from the people. They lived within the same space. And his daughter ran out instead, right? And it says, Raki Yechida Ein La, right? Sorry. And it says she was his only daughter. He had no other, and she runs out to give him a hero's welcome. And what's fascinating, again, if we're going to use achsa as that gold standard, when he says to her, "Oh my God, what have you done?" she is very, very deferential, right? She's no longer the daughter who makes demands of her father. She's now the daughter who says, whatever you said, father, she becomes, and I would say more than deferential, she's almost like obsequious, that whatever he promised, he has to go through with. And he ends up sacrificing her. And, to the Tanakh's credit, it can't even use the words. It just says he did to her as he promised, right? Because, the same way we can't look at those stories from October 7th to actually write the words that he brought his daughter as an olah, which means her entire body had, been burned, is, to the Tanakh's credit, I think too hard to even, articulate.
And so that's why many also just interpret that she basically became a nun.
Right.
You're not supporting that reading, I guess.
No, because I think, again, if we're trying to talk about the tendencies that human capacity for violence when they are not educated properly, then I think to whitewash or to mitigate, what the Tanakh is saying he did, I think is probably, I think it loses what the Tanakh is trying to say, or what this specific sefer. I'll just jump to the last two really horrific stories, which is Pilegesh Begiva, which is
the concubine at Gibeah.
The concubine of Gibeah, and I'm going to summarize a horrific episode, and just so we can get to the main points here. But a man essentially is a woman. His concubine runs to her father's home, which already red flags are raised, because why would a woman in those days leave her husband's home to run back to her father's home? Ultimately, the husband, brings her back to her home, which we're nervous for her. But they're passing through a city of Gibeah. They can't make it home all in one trip. And so they pass through a city where they find the city is very reminiscent of Stone, where they don't want to bring strangers in and they don't want to be hospitable. But one old man does, and he sort of wins us over because he's a sweet old man, and we're picturing how nice he is, that, in contrast to everyone else in the city, he's inviting them in. But very, very quickly, things take a turn for the worse. And the people of the city start banging on the door, again, very similar to the story of Stone. And the man says the words, please don't do this nivala, don't do this horrible, abominable thing by raping my guests, right? Which goes back to your point about rape not being about sexuality, but just being an act of violence. And
because he wanted to rape the man, meaning it was sodomy.
Correct. Correct. The city wanted to sodomize. So he offers his own
child, and then...
So he says, right, don't do this horrible, abominable act. Instead, take my daughters, right? So we know something is really awry. And before they can even, accept or allow the city to respond, the man takes his pilegesh and shoves her out the door, closes it behind her, and the text describes that she is gang raped throughout the entire night. Yeah. She crawls back home. Her hand is on the doorpost when she gets there, in the morning. The man wakes up, it says, which is disturbing because it means he slept through the night.
Yes.
And he says to her, Kumi, get up. And it says, Ve'eno nan, she doesn't respond. And for the first time, a couple of things all of a sudden register, right? Does she not respond because she's already dead? And then we also wonder, we realize for the first time, we haven't heard her speak the entire story, right? So her silence is all of a sudden more palpable. Or
the ultimate victim.
Correct. And it says he throws her on the back of the donkey, rides home, and when he gets there, he cuts her up, which the symbolism is really not even clear. It's very ambiguous. He cuts her body up into 12 pieces, cuts her corpse up, and sends it out to all the tribes and says, how can something like this happen in Israel? Which leads to civil war. And the final episode in the entire book, which again the book uses as the point to say you've hit the point of no return, is there are men from the tribe of Benjamin who, during the civil war, all the other tribes swore, we're not going to marry our daughters to the tribe of Benjamin because they're our enemy. When they realize that the tribe of Benjamin is not going to be able to sustain itself if they don't marry women, which, by the way, the implication that the women from Benjamin had all been slaughtered.
Yes.
They say, you know what, go to this agricultural festival where the girls of Shiloh go out and they dance in the fields in celebration, and just grab those women and take them as your wives. And don't worry if anyone says, what about the vow? Don't worry, say we didn't give them as daughters, the men of Benjamin took them. Right. So
actually, the word used is kidnap.
Kidnap.
It's
right.
That's
it. Wow.
So that's right. It's an important piece there. Wow. It's so horrific.
It's so horrific. And a reader who remembers the story of Bat Yiftach is saying all these brilliant men who could play these semantic games. Where were you when Bat Yiftach couldn't get out of his vow? Right. Yeah. You can get out of a vow when it's convenient, so they can kidnap more women. But when it prevents the murder of a young girl, so all of these things are raised. And I think, wholesale, just to wrap up, because I know we're sort of going long on this book, but if you go back to that idea of the red jacket. So if you look at the beginning of the work, the women are all named. Right? They all have their names. They're all fully sort of developed characters in their own right. And as the stories go on, they become anonymous. But not only do they become anonymous, they become associated with the very men who were meant to protect them. She becomes the concubine of, the daughter of, and which highlights the failures of those very men. Right? If society is making those women vulnerable, then it's on the man at that point in that relationship to protect them. Not only did they not protect them, they were the ones that perpetrated that violence. Right? You have agency. We look at the way the women in the beginning of the Sefer act and behave and speak, and their speech becomes, like we mentioned, more deferential until their voices are silenced. The story in the vineyards in Shiloh, it never says that the girls screamed, right? We saw Sheryl Sandberg screams before. It doesn't say they screamed, but of course they screamed. The text not recording that they were shrieking as they were being grabbed is the text's way of saying, even if they would have, no one would have heard and no one would have cared. Their screams would have fallen on deaf ears. And so, to go from the Achsa who speaks and the Devorah who sings poetry and she's a prophet to women being silenced is a reflection of society. You have it with the vows, right? The vow that's made to create a stable home for Achsa versus the vows later on with the daughter of Yiftach and the women in Shiloh, where it's perverted and no one is there to speak up for them. And I think perhaps most, sort of relevant for our discussion and for what you were saying before in terms of, is the space around me safe? As the work goes on, space itself becomes more and more dangerous. You have Achsa riding on a donkey alone and going home and never thinking twice about it. And you have Devorah sitting out in public and men are coming to her, and we don't know if she had bodyguards, but and she's completely comfortable in that space, and she goes out to war. Yael leaves the tent to bring the enemy in order to protect the tents of all the women around her. And when Bat Yiftach suddenly leaves the threshold of her house, she's suddenly in danger. Pilegesh Begiva, the concubine, even if she tries to stay in the home, she's shoved out the front door. And so, when we think about October 7th, I was speaking to a woman actually who grew up here during the Intifada, and she was saying, she feels like her children are so traumatized. And I said, but you grew up here during the Intifada, and you're okay, like everyone came. She said, no, there's a difference. When we got into our beds at night, we didn't feel scared. She goes, my daughters are growing up in a world where they heard about children being taken out of their beds, right? So as the space encroaches, or the danger encroaches and gets more and more into your personal space, when the concubine is shoved out of that home that she was seeking shelter in, again, all of those images, I think, just become so resonant with what we're talking about.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm kind of coiling inside my own body.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
As you speak, and I guess our listeners are as well. But wait, I wanted two reflections on what you've said. One is, first of all, thank you for that invaluable, really broad reading of the women. I think very often, even just when we turn to a book, right, until we get to the end of it, it's very difficult for people when they're just doing the regular. I do
want to credit, though, sorry, because you said thank you.
Yeah.
It's a lot of when I saw women as a motif is from Tammy Schneider's book on Judges. So I don't want to, meaning I expanded on, I developed, but she really got me thinking in terms of women as a motif. So I just wanted to say that. I should have said it earlier.
Totally. And as we said, there are books where women are more pronounced motifs. It's a fascinating question. Why aren't there many women in the book of Joshua? And it's a very male period of time in that period of conquest. So you have those Rachav, who you already mentioned, but it's fascinating when women are a feature of
they've actually done, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the names. There are two women that actually wrote an article on this, how in Tanakh, when the lives of Israel is more sort of domestically oriented, women take a more, they have a more primary role. And once we have more urbanized centers or kingship, stuff like that, women take a backseat in those stories.
Right. And also just the question of what the book wants to emphasize. And that meaning they're not going to be as present in those, national institutions. Right. But I guess I just wanted to also just zoom out for a moment because and connect it back to what you'd originally said about the book of Shoftim, which is that the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, is really a book that kind of illustrates gradually how the moral decay of the people of Israel and how they really needed to just try a different system. It's also going to be a very flawed system. This isn't a kingship, but we need to try something else because this isn't working. And as the book goes on, and especially those the last 4 chapters of the book from the, chapter 17 to 21, that you really have the sort of the final degradation, both of the family system, different story of the idol of Micha and his mother, and which is another woman in the book, which is fascinating, who's stolen from, and you have there the stories of the concubine at Giva and the civil war. And so as the book goes on, and then the book ends, as you hinted to, with Isha Yashar Be'einav said that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. It was utter chaos, and in utter chaos, many people will suffer, very much so, including women. And women will suffer as a group, meaning these are stories. There is also the singular woman in the story of the daughter of Yiftach, and also in the story of the concubine. But in the end of the book, it's a group of women who suffer, meaning it's not even an individual anymore. Right. We've gotten so bad that we lump together these vulnerables in society. It's also the group of Benjamites, meaning it's a whole tribe. We have many groups of men who are also dying, but the grouping of women
and the women of Yavesh Gilad as well.
Exactly.
Right? If they took 200 virgins from Yavesh Gilad to marry to the Benjamites, that means that any woman that was not a virgin was just slaughtered. Exactly. Right? There's between the lines, so many more groups are also being brutalized.
Exactly. And so we have sort of this, it's one of the, I'm in the middle of teaching it this year. It's just the worst book, meaning there's so much to learn, but you learn, but it's learning all through stories of anti-heroes. You even have the anti-hero Levite in the last, there's a few Levites in the last section, and it basically shows you how everything that a Levite was supposed to do kind of gets perverted as well. So I just wanted to put the woman piece in the context of the book of Judges itself, which basically ends and says everything has gone to pot. We have nothing good that's left. We need to uproot these institutions and transition into our next section.
I would just even tweak. You use the word. You said that final Isha Yashar Be'einav said it's chaos. I would even say it's worse than chaos. It's the chaos
Anarchy.
It's moral relativism, right? Meaning it's Isha Yashar. It's not that people are just doing whatever they want. It's what they actually thought was the right thing to do.
That's a really important point.
Which then leads to chaos, right? There has to be some objective standard for behaviors, which
relevant to today's world, which is complicated.
Yeah. Okay. For the next podcast. Okay. So I wanted to just end because, you asked me when we first originally spoke about, I guess, narratives or pieces in Tanakh that have become either more poignant or just speak to us differently post October 7th. So this is 3 verses that we've seen so many times, or many people have seen often, that I guess after October 7th, when we heard stories about the Hamas terrorists calling home and bragging to their parents about what they did, and their parents being, overjoyed hearing about what their children were doing to innocent people, it made me think of these psukim that I will read in Hebrew, obviously, or I'll just really paraphrase and translate. You have the episode at the very end of the Song of Devorah. The Song of Devorah has the poetic retelling of what happened with Yael and Sisera, and at the very, very end, it's kind of strange because it then switches gears and brings us into the palace where the mother of Sisera is sitting there, and she's sitting there by the window, and she's saying, "Madua boshesh richbo lavo," right? Why is my Sisera late? And it's, as much as we hate Sisera and as much as we know he's the enemy, it's impossible.
And we know he's dead.
And we know he's dead,
late.
right?
Yeah.
The dramatic irony there is also helpful. But I think any woman, I will say, to not even have a tinge of being able to understand what a mother is going through when she's waiting for her son to come home from war. You have that initial, she's still a mother, right? Regardless of who her child is. Until, and this is where I think Tanakh sort of speaks to what maybe some of us didn't want to believe before October 7th, that maybe evil is really passed down from one generation to the next and encouraged. So she's sitting there and she's crying, why is his chariot so late? How come I don't hear the noise of his chariots returning? And it says one of her wise maidens, the women that were helping her young attendants, and it calls her wise, meaning she knew what to say to cheer the mother of Sisera up. She says, no, don't worry. And the words in Hebrew, it says, Haloyim tzu'u yichalku shalal. They're probably out just divvying up the spoils of war. And then it goes on, the second half of the sentence says, Racham rachmatayim l'rosh gever. Don't worry. They're probably just, again, divvying up at Racham rachmatayim, 1 or 2 wombs per man, per soldier, right? Which is, she's basically saying, don't cheer up. It's okay. He's just late because he's out raping women. And she's the chachamot, meaning she knew what to say to cheer up mother of Sisera. And the second to last verse in that song, it says, Kain yovdu kol oivecha Hashem. This is how all of the enemies of God should end, right? Their stories should end like Sisera being decapitated. The story of someone who encourages his son to go out and rape and violate and mutilate women. Their story needs to end the same way that Sisera's did. So, I'll just end because, I know this feels really, really heavy. At the beginning of the war, I remember people I think must have done this to you also, because if you teach Tanakh, people were saying, this all feels so biblical, right? Doesn't it feel so biblical? And I think it does. I think there are so many pieces to this war, to what we are fighting as a people, to what is happening worldwide that feels suddenly so biblical in a way that I think other things have not. So I will just end that if, the horrors feel as biblical as they did, then the miracles that we hope to experience should be of biblical proportions as well. And we have to believe that if we experience the horrors that Tanakh depicts, then we are also able to experience, God's hand in history and God's miracles. And we should really just merit that. We should remain united. We should keep praying for our hostages and our soldiers, for their safe return, for the healing of anyone that needs it, and experience the miracles that God promises alongside all the other things that we're watching.
Yael, I think that I just want to add one piece, which is if we go back to, as you very well corrected me, sort of the moral relativism of the way the book ends, which is that I think that one of the many, many lessons, and you also hinted to it just now as well, but one of the many lessons of what we've experienced, and I hope that the world, whoever is interested in paying attention,
if you're listening,
if you're interested, has noticed, is this idea that not everyone in the world right now is sharing the same system of morality. Yeah. And people really haven't understood that until now. And there were, things said here and there, trying to impose Western values on a Middle Eastern peace process, and that's why it fails, and like a clash of languages. But I think that what we've understood is that it's way more than about a clash of language, meaning there are people who are really, really, yes, they can go to a space where they are considered evil. Mm-hmm. When you say biblical, I often think back to the book of Psalms, right? Where the motif of the tzaddik and the rasha Rasha, the righteous and the evil, comes up. And for years, whenever I teach the different Psalms, I always say, I know these phrases don't, they don't sit well with us. And I like define them. And I say, well, this is what the righteous means in the context of the book of Tehillim. But you know what? There really is evil in the world, and people can do wrong. And there's a lot of good people who do wrong, and sometimes that's us, and sometimes that's somebody else. But there are also people who have made themselves evil, and I think that the book of Shoftim, which is sort of what we highlighted and showcased even more in our conversation today, sort of ends and says we can get to a point in the world when we're at a low point, which doesn't mean we can't turn and go somewhere else after that, but we can get to a low point where the moral relativism, whether it is in the face of, smaller political debates, and right versus left. And we can also get to a space where there is a society that has degraded itself so much to the point where a very large percentage of the people have actually made themselves evil. And I think that that's also a piece of far less positive than the way that you, in theory, wanted to end the episode. But I think that it's very important because it's how the book of Shoftim ends. But to me, the positive element is that, and then the Bible continues, meaning there's another book, there's another era, there's an overlap period. The beginning, the first 9 chapters of the book of Samuel is really the end of the book of Judges. And I love that piece, how the Tanakh always shows you that the history is a continuing progression. There's not really difference between books. But that we can go somewhere else. We can try something else. We can get to different spaces. But just that recognition of everybody is doing what is right in their own eyes. And in some of those eyes, for some people, what they are doing is evil. And it needs to be called out. And the case that we've spoken about today of the case of the violence against women is, of course, one tremendous piece in a broader piece of many, many very difficult things that have happened. So I just want to thank you for, first of all, the candid conversation. And as we said, both of us are kind of a
little emotional inside right now.
No, and it's physically uncomfortable. To talk about violence against women in words that are more detailed than just the word violence, it's physically jarring. I feel it in my body as we speak, and I think that it's really important to shine, a spotlight on on these ideas. So thank you for coming in and doing that today.
Thank you so much for the space. And, again, we should just pray that everyone that needs to come home safely comes home really, really soon.
Amen. Thank you, Yael.